General Hospital spoilers tease that Willow Tate and Drew Kane are headed for a collision neither of them can avoid. It will not be the kind of casual, polite exchange that once passed between them in quieter days, when trust was still a familiar language and when the air between them carried more warmth than tension. This time, the undercurrent is sharp, the stakes higher, and both of them know too much for anything to remain simple. Drew's intentions, whatever their purity or lack thereof, will meet the solid wall of Willow's newly fortified boundaries. Once upon a time, she would have leaned in when he spoke, listened as though each word carried the promise of safety. Those days have been buried beneath betrayals, broken promises, and the slow, painful process of learning who he truly is. Elizabeth Baldwin, ever the voice of tempered reason, had tried to ease the path before this inevitable meeting. She had spoken to Drew with quiet urgency, her words careful but unmistakably firm, pressing the point that Willow needed time and space. Healing, she argued, does not happen under pressure. It needs room to breathe, to unfold naturally, without the constant shadow of the person who caused the wounds in the first place. Elizabeth had hoped he would understand, had hoped the part of him that once respected boundaries would emerge and take her counsel seriously. But Drew's resolve seemed to harden instead. The more she warned him to give Willow space, the more determined he became to close the distance. Willow, meanwhile, stood on the other side of the storm, no longer the woman who sought guidance from Drew's judgment on every matter of consequence. That version of herself, pliable, trusting, had been forged in a time when she believed in him without question. But truth has a way of burning through illusions, and now she saw him in unflinching clarity. She knew every sordid detail of his manipulations, every selfish turn disguised as concern. There was no more veil to hide behind, no comfortable ignorance to retreat to. Her trust had been stripped bare, and in its place grew a steady, deliberate resolve: she would not be steered by him again. The irony was almost cruel. Drew had once been her anchor, and she had clung to him during storms that would have otherwise swept her away. Now he was the storm, the force she needed to guard herself against. His promises, oh, there had been so many, once sounded like solid commitments. Today, they rang hollow, echoes of a pattern she had learned too well. He had promised to be there, promised to fight for her, promised to shield her from harm. But each promise had eventually dissolved into compromise, betrayal, or outright abandonment. Still, the news that he would have a chance to speak with her again lit something in him. It wasn't guilt alone, nor was it the cold calculation of someone plotting their next move. It was hope, stubborn and desperate, clinging to the belief that the right words, spoken at the right moment, could alter the course of her heart. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind more times than he could count, weighing what to confess and what to leave unsaid. When that moment arrived, Drew's demeanor shifted into something deliberately gentle, almost as if he feared startling her away. He spoke as though the air between them was fragile glass. His first words skirted the edges of what had happened, touching lightly on apologies, brushing against the idea of understanding without yet plunging into the rawness of what he'd done. He offered not just explanations, but pledges, vows that this time would be different. And then, with a careful pivot, he let the truth of his feelings surface. He told her plainly, perhaps more plainly than ever before, that he loved her. That Nina Reeves, for all the rumors and assumptions swirling around them, meant nothing to him compared to what he felt for her. Willow listened in silence, her expression controlled, her hands steady at her sides. Inside, there was movement, a swirl of hurt, anger, and something more complicated, but outwardly she gave him nothing to hold on to. She had heard these kinds of speeches before. Love declarations, carefully timed confessions, and last-ditch promises were part of Drew's repertoire. She knew the pattern: lay the groundwork with remorse, build a bridge with sentiment, and seal it with a pledge to be better. And yet, in all the times he had sworn to change, the follow-through had never matched the words. Still, Drew pressed on. He admitted to understanding her anger, acknowledged the hurt he had caused. But beneath that acknowledgement lay an unwavering certainty: in his mind, there was still a future for them. He saw a path forward as a couple, despite the debris of mistrust and disappointment that lay between them. And so he made the appeal that had been burning in him for weeks: another chance. One last opportunity to prove he could be the man she needed, the man he insisted he could become. Then came the carrot he thought might tip the scales. Drew hinted at plans already in motion, strategies and moves he was making behind the scenes. These weren't just for his own benefit, he assured her, but for hers. Most of all, he spoke of helping her reclaim her child, a cause that would pierce any mother's heart. It was a calculated offer, wrapped in the guise of selflessness, and Drew knew it. But Willow was no longer the woman who could be swayed by the right mixture of sentiment and incentive. She heard the promises for what they were: attempts to anchor himself in her life again, to tie his presence to something she could not ignore. And she questioned, silently and with growing certainty, why she should believe that this time would be any different from the others. His words held no new evidence, no demonstration of change. Only a repetition of the same melody she had heard too many times before. The air thickened between them as her silence stretched on. Drew filled it with more assurances, each one a thread he hoped would tether her to him. He vowed not to give up, not to walk away simply because she told him to. He insisted that no was not a final answer, not for them. That defiance, the same quality that once felt like loyalty, now felt like intrusion. And Willow knew that a man who refused to accept her boundaries was a man who might be willing to cross lines she had no intention of letting him cross again. Drew's persistence was no longer flattering, it was a warning. Yet he didn't seem to see it. In his mind, the more he pushed, the closer he would come to breaking through. The truth, however, was that every push only confirmed her reasons for keeping the wall firmly in place. And still, somewhere deep beneath her resolve, the confrontation stirred emotions she wished weren't there. There was a part of her that remembered who he had been before the lies, before the disappointments piled high enough to obscure the man she had once loved. That part of her hated that he could still make her feel anything at all. But feelings, she reminded herself, were not facts, and love was not a justification for letting history repeat itself. The tension between Willow and Drew did not dissolve after their exchange. It clung to both of them like a shadow, following them through every glance, every pause, every unfinished sentence. Drew left the conversation with a restless energy, the kind that refuses to settle until it finds resolution. He told himself he had planted the seed for change, that Willow's measured silence was a sign she was considering his words. But beneath that self-assurance lurked frustration. He wanted progress, movement, and he wanted it on his timeline, not hers. For Willow, the meeting had reinforced exactly why she needed distance. She could feel how carefully Drew had chosen his words, how each apology and promise was positioned like a chess move. It was not the raw honesty she wanted, it was a strategy. That awareness only made her more determined to hold her ground. She had learned the hard way that accepting even a sliver of his reasoning could open the door to being pulled back into the same exhausting cycle. The memory of past disappointments was sharper than ever, and she was unwilling to test whether the latest promises would collapse like the others. Elizabeth watched the fallout from the sidelines, deeply uneasy. She had hoped that by urging Drew to give Willow space, she might prevent this very situation, an encounter that only deepened the divide. Elizabeth knew both of them well enough to understand the danger of Drew's persistence and Willow's resolve colliding head-on. When neither person is willing to shift, the result is rarely peaceful. She also understood that Drew's refusal to let go was not just about love, it was about control, about needing to steer the outcome even when it was not his decision to make. That control was exactly what Willow feared most. Drew's history with her was full of moments when his influence had overridden her instincts, when his certainty had drowned out her doubts. Now that she was standing firmly in her own convictions, she had no interest in returning to a dynamic where her voice was secondary. Yet she suspected Drew would not accept that truth easily. She could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes during their talk, the way he stored away her reactions to use later. As the days passed, Drew's determination began to take on a different shape. He replayed the conversation over and over, focusing not on Willow's refusals but on the moments he thought he saw hesitation. He convinced himself those moments meant she was still reachable, that if he could just find the right angle, she would let him in again. This belief became his justification for staying close, for finding reasons to cross paths with her even when it was clear she preferred otherwise. Elizabeth noticed these maneuvers and worried that Drew was stepping into dangerous territory. She debated confronting him again, but she knew how he responded to criticism when he was convinced he was right. Instead, she decided to keep a watchful eye, ready to step in if his pursuit crossed a line. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Drew was preparing to use more aggressive tactics, ones that might test Willow's patience to its limits. Willow, for her part, braced herself for the possibility that Drew would not go quietly. She understood his personality well enough to know that a direct no was not the end for him, it was the start of a campaign. She could already imagine the ways he might try to work around her boundaries, whether through emotional appeals, public gestures, or even leveraging her vulnerabilities. His mention of helping her reclaim her child had not been forgotten. It was exactly the kind of offer he might use as leverage, tying his presence to something she deeply cared about. The thought made her uneasy. She did not want her fight for her child's future to be tangled up with Drew's need to prove himself. If he truly wanted to help, she believed he could do so without strings attached. But Willow doubted he would ever separate his personal agenda from his promises. That meant she had to be cautious, choosing her words carefully when they inevitably crossed paths again. In Drew's mind, however, the situation was moving toward a critical turning point. He convinced himself that time was running out to change her perception of him. The longer she stayed resolute, the harder it would be to dismantle her defenses. He began to imagine scenarios where he could demonstrate his value to her in ways she couldn't ignore. These ideas weren't necessarily ethical, but in his view, they were justified by the outcome he sought. Elizabeth began to suspect that Drew was considering actions that would blur moral lines. She saw the subtle shift in his demeanor, a mix of restlessness and quiet plotting. Whenever his plans for Willow came up in conversation, there was a flicker in his expression that told her he was holding back more than he was saying. It made her uneasy, but she also knew confronting him without proof would only push him deeper into secrecy. For Willow, the path forward was clear, even if it was painful. She needed to make it unmistakable that her life was no longer open for Drew to shape. This meant not only resisting his words but also preparing for the possibility that he might attempt to manipulate circumstances around her. She thought about speaking to Elizabeth, hoping that an ally who understood both sides could help keep Drew's interference in check. Yet part of her hesitated, trusting anyone too much, even with good intentions, felt risky in the current climate. As events edged toward their next chapter, each person carried their own private certainty. Drew believed persistence would pay off. Willow believed boundaries were her only defense. Elizabeth believed both of them were headed toward a confrontation neither fully understood yet. Somewhere between those convictions lay the truth of what was coming. Drew's inability to accept finality meant he would keep pressing until something broke either her resistance or his image in her eyes beyond repair. Willow's steadfast refusal meant that if he pushed too hard, he risked not just rejection but complete alienation. Elizabeth's role as the quiet observer might shift into something more active, but whether she could prevent the fallout was a question none of them could yet answer. And so, the stage was set for the next move, each of them holding their breath in different ways, waiting for the moment when choices would have to be made in the open, with consequences that could not be undone. The distance between Willow and Drew was no longer just emotional, it had begun to reshape the space around them. Every shared room felt charged, every glance heavy with what was unsaid. Willow kept her movements deliberate, her interactions measured, making it clear that any conversation beyond the strictly necessary was unwelcome. Yet Drew found ways to linger, to appear at moments when she least expected it, as though proximity alone could wear down her resistance. It was in one of these unplanned encounters that the tension reached a dangerous tipping point. Willow had been in the hospital corridor, speaking quietly with a nurse about routine matters, when Drew appeared. He smiled as though the earlier confrontations had never happened, as if the past weeks of silence were a small bump in an otherwise unbroken bond. He asked her for a few minutes, his tone suggesting that refusal would be unreasonable. She hesitated, not because she wanted to say yes, but because she sensed that another blunt rejection would only fuel his determination to corner her elsewhere. Drew took the hesitation as an opening and began to speak before she could decide. He told her about progress he was making in areas he knew mattered to her, legal inquiries, potential allies, even vague references to people who might influence the outcome of her custody battle. He spoke quickly, as if delivering a gift she'd been waiting for, his eyes fixed on hers to catch the first flicker of gratitude. But Willow did not give it. Instead, she asked a simple, direct question: what would he want in return? Drew faltered for the briefest moment, then denied that he expected anything. Still, the pause was enough to tell her everything she needed to know. She recognized the familiar pattern: offers of help wrapped around a quiet expectation of access, gratitude, and eventual reconciliation. The realization only deepened her resolve. Elizabeth, who had been within earshot, approached soon after Drew left. She didn't speak immediately, allowing Willow the space to gather herself. When she finally did, her voice was gentle but firm. She warned Willow that Drew's fixation seemed to be growing, that his inability to accept her boundaries was beginning to look less like persistence and more like obsession. Willow admitted she had noticed the same shift, though hearing it from someone else gave the thought more weight. They agreed, without making it official, to watch for signs that Drew's tactics were escalating. The escalation came sooner than either expected. Drew began involving himself in matters connected to Willow without her consent, arranging meetings, speaking to people on her behalf, even making decisions that affected her plans. He framed these actions as support, but the effect was the opposite. It undermined her autonomy, chipping away at the control she had fought so hard to reclaim. Each incident felt like a reminder that he still believed he had a claim to her life, whether she accepted him back or not. Willow confronted him directly, choosing a public setting so the conversation could not devolve into the private manipulation she had endured before. She told him plainly that his interference was unacceptable, that every step he took without her approval only pushed her further away. Drew tried to turn her words into proof of her passion, suggesting that her anger showed she still cared. The logic was twisted, but he seemed to believe it. Elizabeth stepped in then, no longer content to simply observe. She told Drew that if he truly wanted to help Willow, the most meaningful thing he could do was step back completely. She reminded him that love without respect for boundaries was not love at all, and that the version of himself he claimed to want to be was incompatible with the actions he was taking now. Drew listened, but his expression remained unreadable, the stubborn set of his jaw betraying that her words would not change his mind. In the days that followed, Drew's efforts became quieter but no less intrusive. Instead of overt gestures, he began working behind the scenes, making arrangements he believed would prove his worth to Willow when the time came. He seemed to think that if he could engineer a victory for her, especially one as personal as regaining her child, she would have no choice but to see him differently. But in doing so, he risked creating exactly the opposite reaction. If Willow discovered that her victories came through his interference, she might see them as tainted, the strings attached outweighing the benefits. The final confrontation came in a place neither of them had planned. Willow had been visiting a friend when she learned, almost by accident, that a key development in her custody case had been influenced by someone acting in her name. She didn't need to be told who it was. She found Drew later that day, and this time, there was no hesitation, no carefully controlled expression. Her anger was cold and clear. She told him that whatever good he thought he was doing was not his to give, that his refusal to let her live her life on her terms was the very reason there could be no reconciliation. Drew tried once more to reach her, his voice urgent, almost desperate. He told her he couldn't walk away knowing there was still a chance for them, that everything he had done was out of love. But Willow, unmoved, told him love without trust was a hollow thing, and that he had broken the trust beyond repair. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, she simply ended it. Not the way one ends an argument, but the way one closes a door that will never be opened again. Elizabeth, who had been made aware of the exchange soon after, felt a complicated relief. She hated seeing anyone in pain, but she knew that clarity, however painful, was better than the slow erosion of boundaries. She resolved to keep watch in case Drew's obsession flared again, but something in his demeanor after that final meeting suggested he had been forced to accept the truth. Whether that truth would lead him to reflection or simply to a quieter form of persistence was something only time would reveal. For Willow, the ending was not triumphant, but it was freeing. She walked away knowing she had chosen herself, chosen her autonomy over the comfort of familiarity, even when that familiarity had once felt like safety. The path ahead would still be difficult, there were still battles to fight, still wounds to heal, but they would be her battles, fought on her terms. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough.